Finland now had a new, much larger neighbor that was born out of the ashes of the Russian Civil War. The victorious Bolsheviks turned into the Communist Party and reshaped the old Russian Empire into the newly formed Soviet Union. Little did Finland know that it would not be privy to the Soviet regime's plan to reconquer territories lost in the aftermath of the war. One such territory that the Soviet Union did keep was most of Karelia, which had been designated the Karelian Laborers' Commune in June 1920, having been founded by Finnish communist Edvard Geiling. Although Finland escaped Soviet encroachment for some 21 years, its linguistic neighbor Karelia was not so lucky. Being seen as a backward language, Karelian was supplanted by Finnish in regional schools, with the express purpose of enabling a cultural connection should Finland have a revolution of its own. Yet such a revolution never occurred, and by the late 1930s, Europe was gearing up for its Second Great War. With the risk of war at its highest in nearly 2 decades, Soviet officials decided to switch back to a Cyrillic version of Karelian, and on January 1, 1938, Finnish as a language disappeared from the Republic. Meanwhile, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, was concocting a secret agreement with Nazi Germany in order to demarcate each power's respective spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Originally signed on August 23, 1939, what would be known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was modified again on August 28th. Thus, Germany attacked Poland just 4 days later, sparking World War II. The Soviets were deeply encouraged and proceeded to occupy eastern Poland on September 17th, thus allowing for another modification of the pact on September 28th. The Soviets finally had a free hand at Finland. According to Professor Richard Tempest, Stalin's reasoning for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was quite simple.
What he saw were competing imperialist great powers, that's his perspective, just as happened before World War I, who were engaged in a struggle for markets and influence.
By October, Stalin precisely used his position as leverage for territorial expansion into Finland. How moderate these territorial demands were is up for debate. However, they included the cession of Finnish territory northwest of Leningrad, the islands of Koivisto and Hagland, the far northern port of Petsamo, and the right to lease Hanko. In exchange, the Soviet Union was ready to cede thinly inhabited territory in Karelia. However, this was met with rejection, particularly due to the lease of Hanko, thus incentivizing the Soviets to stage a Finnish military provocation on November 26th. The Winter War had begun, and what soon followed was disaster for the Soviets, as tiny Finland was able to mount resistance for a solid 3 months.
Finland may be a small nation, but our law of freedom will never let us accept defeat.
126,000 Red Army soldiers died, a figure more than 6 times higher than the Finnish losses. Yet the Soviets ultimately won and enforced their terms. Finland was scarred, but still remained independent. The new territorial acquisitions brought nearly all of Karelia under the control of the Soviet Union, thus allowing the regime breathing space and allowing for the readoption of Finnish in the now upgraded Karelo-Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic, retaining a similar status to other Union republics. But with the fall of France in the west and the annexation of the Baltic states and Bessarabia to the east, tensions remained high. And so, on June 22nd, 1941, the unthinkable happened: the German invasion of the Soviet Union. At this point, the Finnish military was mobilized since it had previously joined the German military in planning for the invasion of Russia. 3 days later, Soviet aerial attacks against Finland gave the Finnish government the pretext needed to open hostilities, and war was declared on June 26th. What is now known as the Continuation War became particularly bloody, with a prolonged reoccupation of much of Karelia by Finnish forces. 3 years dragged on until a preliminary offensive to Operation Bagration was initiated by the Soviets. Although the offensive was stopped, the Finns, having been exhausted, needed a way out of the war, and in September 1944 they sued for peace. The conditions of this treaty were extensive, but included two provisos of particular importance: the expulsion of all German forces from Finland and the 50-year lease of the Porkala Peninsula. The first caused conflict, resulting in the Lapland War, in which Finland successfully expulsed German forces from its territories. The second has to do with the reason why Finland never entered the Soviet sphere of influence after the war. Finland had a history of a strong communist party that alleviated the fears of Soviet policymakers. Yet this peace of mind was further reinforced by the transit rights allowed to Porkala, which effectively allowed the Soviet Union the ability to check future Finnish military power. On the plus side, the Soviets also didn't want to antagonize neighboring Sweden into joining NATO, given their long-standing policy of neutrality. It also helped that another peace treaty was signed between the powers in 1948. The Continuation War also influenced Soviet policy in Karelia. The 3-year Finnish occupation of much of Karelia allowed for a Finnicization that was further reinforced by the continuation of Finnish as an official language of the region, once Soviet forces reoccupied Karelia in 1944. Seemingly enough, Finnish-Soviet relations thawed incredibly fast in the post-war period, with the now Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev withdrawing Soviet forces from Porkala and subsequently downgrading the Karelo-Finnish Republic to the Karelian Autonomous Republic. The Soviet Union no longer needed a territorial entity that could challenge the legitimacy of Finland. Thus, Karelian autonomy was curtailed. Although everything seemed hunky-dory in the far north, the rest of the world was engaged in a bitterly ideological Cold War, with the two main belligerents being the capitalist United States and socialist Soviet Union. Each side was further divided into their respective camps, the US-backed NATO and Soviet-backed Warsaw Pact. You see, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union came to occupy much of Eastern and Central Europe, thus installing satellite regimes in order to create a buffer with the West. This led to an unspoken status quo that led dangerously close to war, multiple times. Yet in the midst of all this stood one tiny, obscure, northern country that would host a peace conference between the two camps: Finland. So in 1975, representatives of the Western camp met with representatives of the Soviet camp in Helsinki, the Finnish capital, leading to the Helsinki Agreement on European Security and Cooperation, otherwise known as the Helsinki Accords. In the agreement, the United States and its Western allies effectively recognized the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, but in exchange, the Soviet Union had to uphold human rights. Such an agreement bolstered the Soviet dissenter movement, which proceeded to create the Helsinki Watch Committee. The thawing of Finnish-Soviet relations continued unabated well into the 1980s, with around 25% of Finland's foreign trade being conducted with their eastern neighbor. However, a combination of economic stagnation and the resurgence of national movements gave way to an internal crisis in the USSR. The new, more liberally minded Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, thought the nationality question answered with the nations of the USSR being a single family of Soviet people. However, behind the scenes, he was fast at work in extending autonomy to territories like Karelia. On April 26, 1990, he passed legislation that would allow autonomous republics like Karelia the same prerogative as union republics, effectively upgrading it back to its pre-1956 status. But it was too late for the Union, and on December 31, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was no more. Suddenly, there seemed to be the real possibility that its successor state, the Russian Federation, would disintegrate due to the quasi-feudal pressures from its autonomous units. However, what was deemed as the modern time of troubles subsided, and most of Karelia remained part of the Russian Federation, even until this day. This brings us to the final point, dubbed the Karelian Question. Yet since the Second World War, Finland has not questioned the legality of Russia's possession of Karelia, often referring to it as a non-issue. Thea Sinbeck Anderson and Barbara Tornkist Pleva even posit how it's a good example how smoothly, relatively speaking, difficult questions in Russo-Finnish relations were handled. Even up to now, the restoration of Karelia to Finland has not received support from more than 1/3 of the citizens in public opinion polls. Finnish-Russian relations have been littered in war and peace, as Tolstoy firmly puts it, from the onset of the Middle Ages to the brutality of the Second World War. However, it is quite remarkable how countries with so much reason for animosity toward one another seem to coexist so peacefully. After all, both sides have been in close continuous contact for so long. How about we all be friends and hate just a little bit more on the Swedes? Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed that very simple trailer to the upcoming documentary Operation Bagration. I'm trying to see whether I could use video game footage, historical footage, lecture slides, everything, so that I can make this one of the most comprehensive and richly detailed documentaries about the Second World War on YouTube. I hope you all help me in that. If you would like to help me further, please join my Patreon. I post things on occasion there that really helps me out. Anyway, thank you again to everyone for watching this.